The notification came through at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a client presentation. My phone buzzed against the conference table, screen up, and I watched the name Westbrook Academy blink at me 3 times before I excused myself from the room. The woman on the other end had the careful tone of someone trained to deliver bad news without technically saying anything. She told me my son had been involved in an altercation. She told me he was suspended, effective immediately. She told me to come as soon as possible. I set my coffee cup down on the credenza, told my assistant to reschedule the rest of my afternoon, and picked up my bag. Driving to Westbrook takes 22 minutes from my firm's downtown Chicago office. I know because I have made that drive dozens of times: school plays, parent-teacher conferences, the occasional pickup when my husband Derek was traveling for work, which was often. I have always been the one who shows up. I have always been the one who drives the 22 minutes. I did not speed. I did not call Derek. I turned the radio off and drove in silence, because silence is where I do my best thinking, and I had a lot to think about. My son Noah is 14. He is tall for his age, with Derek's dark eyes and an expression that has never once looked at me the way I imagined a child would look at his mother. I used to think it was a personality thing. Some kids are warm, some kids are not. I told myself that for years, and I almost believed it. Almost. The principal's office at Westbrook smells like old wood and carpet cleaner. Noah was already seated when I arrived, slouched in a chair with his arms crossed, the collar of his uniform shirt crooked. There was a red mark on his cheekbone. He looked at me the way he always does, like I am a minor inconvenience that happens to pay his tuition. The principal, Dr. Hargrove, shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. She was measured and professional, the way expensive private school administrators always are when they are about to tell you something ugly about your child. Noah had been targeting a group of girls from the outreach program, she explained. The academy partnered with a nonprofit 3 blocks away, bringing in kids from the community for extracurricular enrichment. Several of the girls had filed complaints over the past month, small things, individually, mocking comments, blocking them in hallways, taking their materials. Individually, nothing actionable. Together, a pattern. That afternoon, one of the outreach girls had confronted him directly. It escalated. She had pushed him first, Dr. Hargrove acknowledged, but only after he had cornered a younger girl and made her cry for the 3rd time that week. I looked at Noah. He shrugged. He actually shrugged. I asked who the girl was, the one who pushed him. Dr. Hargrove glanced at her notes. Her name was Jade. She was 15, part of the Linwood House program, a group home about 4 blocks east of campus. She had already been collected by her caseworker and was fine, just shaken. I told Dr. Hargrove I understood completely. I thanked her for calling me. I told Noah to stand up. The walk to the car was the usual silence. He was the one who broke it, just like he always is, because he knows silence bothers me less than it bothers him. He said Derek wouldn't have made it into such a big deal. I said Derek wasn't here. He muttered something under his breath that I let go, because I was already thinking about the girl named Jade and the way Dr. Hargrove had said her name with a small, specific kind of sorrow that I recognized without being able to explain. I took Noah to the urgent care clinic, 2 blocks from our condo. The mark on his cheek needed to be looked at regardless of whose fault it was. He protested the entire way in, said it was nothing, said I was overreacting, said Derek would have just taken him home. The clinic was quiet for a Tuesday. A nurse practitioner took Noah back almost immediately, and I waited in the hall with my phone in my hand, not looking at it, listening to the sound of the overhead lights. That is when the school counselor found me. Her name was Miss Renner. She had followed us from Westbrook to make sure I had the outreach program coordinator's contact information. She said, in case I wanted to reach out to apologize formally on behalf of the family. She was kind about it. She was the kind of person who is kind even when delivering uncomfortable suggestions. She handed me a card, and as she turned to go, she paused. She looked at me with the expression people wear when they are trying to place a name. She said, Mrs. Calloway, can I ask your daughter, the one Noah mentioned a few times in our sessions? Chloe, I think he called her? Is everything okay with her? I heard the words. I processed them in sequence. I understood each one individually, but standing together like that, in that order, they did not make any sense. I said, I'm sorry. Miss Renner smiled, patient. Your daughter. Noah's brought her up a couple of times, said she's not doing well. I just wanted to check in sometimes when kids have a sibling in a difficult situation at home, it affects their behavior at school. The hallway was very bright. The lights seemed louder than they had before. I said, very carefully, Miss Renner, I don't have a daughter. She looked at me the same way I imagine I looked at her. The smile held for a moment, then shifted into something uncertain. I must have misunderstood him. I'm so sorry. Sometimes kids talk around things and I fill in the gaps. Please, don't think anything of it. She left quickly, embarrassed. I stayed where I was with her business card in my hand, staring at the middle distance. I do not have a daughter. I had one pregnancy, 5 years into my marriage to Derek. It was complicated placenta previa, early hospitalization, an emergency delivery at 33 weeks. I was not conscious for much of it. When I woke up, Derek told me we had a son, premature, small, in the NICU. He told me it would be a while before I could hold him. It was 2 weeks before I held Noah. 2 weeks in which Derek managed all the information, all the updates, all the access. He said the doctors were concerned about overstimulating the baby. He said they had to be careful. He said I needed to rest. I rested. I trusted him. I was 28 years old and I had just nearly died on an operating table, and the man I married was standing in front of me telling me our son needed protection. I believed him. Standing in that clinic hallway, I took a very slow breath in and an even slower one out. Then I walked to the nearest restroom, locked the door, sat down on the closed lid of the toilet, and thought. Noah had mentioned a daughter. A sister. Chloe. I did not have a daughter named Chloe. But I had been unconscious during a delivery 5 years into my marriage to a man I was increasingly, quietly realizing I did not know at all. I came out of the restroom when they called me back for Noah's discharge paperwork. He had a minor bruise, nothing serious. I signed everything. I drove us home. I made dinner. I helped Noah with the chemistry problem set he had due Thursday, not because he asked, but because it gave me something to do with my hands. After he went to his room, I went to mine. I closed the door. I opened my laptop. I am an architect. My entire professional life is built around the ability to look at a set of plans and identify what is missing, the load-bearing wall that should be there and isn't, the support structure that has been left out of the blueprint. It is not dramatic. It is just the habit of looking at what exists and asking what it implies about what doesn't. I started with what I had. Derek traveled frequently, roughly 10 to 14 days a month. He worked in private equity, which meant the travel was real and the schedule was genuinely unpredictable. I had never questioned it because there was never a reason to, and because questioning Derek felt, in our marriage, like a project I did not have the bandwidth to begin. I pulled up 5 years of our joint credit card statements and looked at them differently than I ever had before. There was a pattern. There had always been a pattern, I just hadn't been looking for it. Every 3 to 4 weeks, an ATM withdrawal in the Pilsen neighborhood, not downtown, not near his office, not near any restaurant or venue we had ever been to together. $200, sometimes $3, cash, for 6 years. I found the first one dated 11 days after I was discharged from the hospital. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning I did 2 things before Noah was awake. First, I called Dr. Amber Walsh, the OB who had not delivered Noah but had taken over my postpartum care, and asked if she could pull any records from my 2015 delivery at Northwestern Memorial. She said it would take a few days to locate everything, but she remembered my case had been complicated, and she would see what she could find. Second, I called a private investigator named Sandra Okafor, who had done work for my firm once on a contractor dispute and who I knew to be both thorough and quiet. I told her I needed 2 things: the address connected to a pattern of cash withdrawals in Pilsen, and any information she could find on a girl named Jade, 15 years old, currently at Linwood House. Sandra did not ask why. She said she would be in touch in 48 hours. I went about my week. I went to work. I managed Noah's suspension by requiring him to complete an independent study packet and write a formal apology letter 1 page. Specific, no generalities to each of the girls he had been targeting. He resisted. I was immovable. On the second day he asked why I was being so much harder on him about this than Derek would be. I said because Derek isn't here, and because here are the facts: someone smaller than you was scared because of something you did, and the correct response to that is not a shrug. He stared at me with those dark eyes that have never once looked like mine. Then he took the paper and the pen and started writing. Sandra called on the morning of day 3. I was at my desk with the door closed. The Pilsen address was a two-flat on West 23rd Street. The second-floor unit had been rented since 2015 under a lease co-signed by a woman named Tara Nguyen. Derek's name was not on the lease, but Sandra had found a 2015 utility account at the same address, also in Tara Nguyen's name, with a secondary contact listed as Derek Michael Calloway. Tara Nguyen was 34. She had grown up in Evanston, worked as a middle school art teacher. No criminal record. One previous address in Wicker Park, before the move to Pilsen. One child listed in property tax filings for the unit, a dependent under 16, which tracked with the rent stabilization credit she had been claiming. One child. Sandra had also found Jade. Jade Nguyen was 15. She had been placed with Linwood House at age 9 after Tara Nguyen had voluntarily relinquished guardianship, following what the records described as a family circumstance change. She had been in the system since then. The Linwood House program had enrolled her in the Westbrook Academy Outreach Partnership 18 months ago. Sandra said very carefully, "Maya, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly so I know how far to take this." I said okay. She said, "When was your delivery date?" "October 14th, 2015. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said Jade Nguyen's birthday was October 13th, 2015. I put the phone down on my desk, not because I needed to stop talking, but because I needed both hands free to press them flat against the surface of something solid. 1 day apart, same hospital system. I had delivered at Northwestern Memorial. Sandra said she would check whether Tara Nguyen had as well. I already knew the answer. I had DNA testing arranged through a private lab by the end of that week. Sandra had sourced a hair sample from Jade's Linwood House file collected during a routine intake update, part of their records. I provided my own. The lab promised results in 5 business days with expedited processing. While I waited, I found out about Tara. She had not disappeared. She was still in Pilsen, still teaching. Derek still visited, though less frequently since Jade had gone into care roughly once a month now, instead of every 3 weeks. Sandra had photos. Derek at the door of the two-flat. Derek and Tara at a coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon when he had texted me that he was stuck in a client meeting until 6. There was one photo from 4 months ago that I looked at for a long time. Derek and Tara at what appeared to be a school event, a gym, folding chairs, a banner. They were sitting next to each other, and Derek had his hand on her arm in that particular way he has, the proprietary placement that I used to think was affection. They were watching Jade perform in what appeared to be a science fair presentation. Jade, who lived in a group home because her mother had given her up at 9 years old. Jade, who came to Westbrook 3 days a week through an outreach program and had spent those 3 days being cornered by my son. Jade, who had finally pushed back and whose pushback had sent a school counselor down a clinic hallway to ask me about my daughter. I want to be clear that I did not cry. I am not saying this to perform strength, I am saying it because it is accurate. The emotion I felt was not grief, or not primarily grief. It was something more like the sensation of a blueprint finally resolving into coherence. Like standing in front of a building that has always seemed slightly wrong and suddenly understanding why there is a wall missing and everything else has been compensating for the gap. I had been compensating for a gap for 14 years. The DNA results came back on a Thursday morning. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee when the email arrived. The report was thorough and clinical. A 99.97% probability of a biological half-sibling relationship between sample A and sample B, which meant that whatever else was true, Noah and Jade Nguyen shared a father. I forwarded the report to my attorney before I finished the coffee. Then I sat quietly for a moment and thought about Jade, this girl I had never met, who defended children smaller than her in schoolyards and who had been failed in every direction by every adult in her life. Her mother had given her up. Her father had attended her science fair from a folding chair and then gone home to his other life. And my son, raised by that father's values, had spent a month making her feel small. I thought about the girl she might have been. The girl she still was, despite all of it. Then I called Sandra and told her I was ready to move. There are 2 ways to destroy a man like Derek. The quiet way is through lawyers and paperwork and the slow machinery of divorce proceedings. The result is the same financial separation. Legal dissolution. The end, but it is private, and private means he gets to manage the story. The other way is to let him tell it himself, in a room full of people who will not let him walk it back. Derek's firm hosted an annual client appreciation dinner every November at the Peninsula Hotel. It was a significant event, 70 or 80 people, the kind of client relationships that had taken him 15 years to build. He had been on the planning committee this year. He had already sent me the invitation, already assumed I would attend. I RSVP'd for 2. In the weeks before the dinner, I continued to be exactly the wife Derek expected me to be. I met with my attorney daily. I filed the initial divorce petition quietly, to be officially served on the morning after the dinner. I arranged with the family court liaison Sandra recommended to begin the process of establishing guardianship for Jade, a longer road, the attorney warned me, but one that could be started. And I continued to go to Linwood House. I had reached out to the program coordinator the week after the DNA results, explaining that I wanted to make an anonymous donation and to volunteer. I said my son had been responsible for some of the bullying behavior, and I wanted to make it right in a concrete way. She was grateful and cautious in equal measure, which I respected. I showed up on a Saturday morning with 2 boxes of drafting supplies, pencils, rulers, architecture paper, a few how-to books, because the coordinator had mentioned Jade had shown interest in design. I wasn't sure it would land. I expected wariness, maybe outright rejection. Jade came into the common room and looked at the boxes, the way someone looks at a puzzle they're deciding whether to solve. She was taller than I expected, serious-faced. She had a small scar on her chin from what looked like an old fall, and she stood with her weight on her back foot, ready to exit if necessary. She looked at me, and then at the drafting supplies, and then back at me. She said, "You're Noah's mom." I said yes. She said, "He wrote me an apology letter. It was actually pretty specific. Not a lot of kids do specific." I said I had required specific. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth, but the withdrawal of a certain kind of suspicion. She picked up one of the architecture books and flipped through it with the focus of someone who is genuinely reading and not performing interest. She looked up after a moment and said, "Can you actually show me how the load distribution thing works? The book explains it, but the diagrams are bad." I pulled up a chair. For 45 minutes, I walked her through the basics of how weight moves through a structure, how every element in a building is in conversation with every other element, how what looks like empty space is often doing the most critical work. She asked precise questions. She caught an error in one of the book's diagrams before I pointed it out. When the session ended and the other kids came in for lunch, she stood up and gathered the materials without being asked. At the door, she paused without turning around. She said, "Same time next Saturday?" I said yes. Over the following 3 weeks, we built something cautious and specific and real. We did not talk about feelings. We talked about cantilevers and stress loads and why certain bridges fail and how the Romans figured out the arch 2,000 years ago without calculators. She showed me a sketch she had done of the Linwood House building. She had identified 3 structural inefficiencies in the drawing, with annotations in the margins, neat and confident. She was extraordinary. She was also 15 and had been let down so thoroughly and so consistently that she treated kindness like a variable she had not yet solved for. I did not push. I showed up. I brought the materials she asked for. I answered her questions honestly. I did not make promises I wasn't certain I could keep. What I kept thinking, watching her work, watching the focused quiet that came over her when she was drawing, was how much of her had simply been grown in the dark. How much of who she was had happened without any of the conditions that are supposed to make it possible. I thought about that a lot in the nights leading up to the Peninsula dinner. The night of the event, I wore a black dress I had owned for 4 years and never had occasion to use. It was structured and quiet, which felt correct. I arrived with Derek, who spent the car ride reviewing talking points about Q4 returns and seemed in a good mood, which he often is when he believes things are going according to plan. The ballroom was warm and loud with the particular energy of wealthy people performing relaxation. Derek moved through it easily, a hand on my back, the perfect couple presentation he has always been very good at. I smiled. I shook hands. I accepted a glass of sparkling water. I waited. Around 8 o'clock, Derek was pulled into a cluster of senior partners near the bar. I excused myself and went to speak with the event coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who had done exactly what I had asked of her in 3 previous conversations over the past 2 weeks. At 8:17, the room's ambient music faded. The small projection screen used for award presentations lit up. I walked to the center of the room. Derek looked up from his conversation. The expression that crossed his face in the half-second before his professional mask reasserted itself, that expression was something I will not forget. It was the face of a man who has just understood that the building he is standing in does not have the supports he thought it did. I did not use a microphone. The room was not that large, and I have always had a clear voice. I said I wanted to take a moment, since so many important people in Derek's life were gathered in one place, to share something that I thought everyone deserved to know. Derek said my name. Just my name, sharp and low, the way he says it when he wants me to understand that I am making a mistake. I kept going. I said that 14 years ago, I nearly died delivering a baby in a Chicago hospital. I said I was unconscious for the most critical hours, and that when I woke up, my husband was the only source of information I had. I said I believed everything he told me, because I was 28, and I had almost died, and the man I married was standing in front of me, and trusting him seemed like the only reasonable thing left to do. The room was very quiet. I said that a school counselor, 3 weeks ago, had asked me about my daughter. I said I did not have a daughter. I believed that sincerely. I had believed it for 14 years, and that her question had started a process that ended with a DNA test and a 60-year-old delivery record pulled from hospital archives. The projection screen showed the document. Dr. Walsh had come through. The original delivery record from October 13, 2015, one day before Noah's registered birthday, listed a female infant delivered to a patient matching my identifying information in an adjacent room, a delivery I had no memory of because I had been sedated and then transferred before regaining consciousness. The clerical handwriting on the transfer paperwork was not mine. The signature on the consent forms had not been witnessed by anyone from the hospital. Then the screen showed the DNA report. Derek was very still. He had gone the particular gray of someone who has rehearsed this scenario privately and found the rehearsal entirely inadequate. I said that my daughter's name was Jade. I said she was 15 years old and that she currently lived at Linwood House, 4 blocks from the school where my son had spent a month making her life difficult. I said she was the most structurally sound person I had ever met, which was saying something, because I had spent 20 years studying structures. A woman near the back of the room made a sound that might have been a sob. I said that I was not asking for anything from anyone in this room. I was not making a speech about forgiveness or resolution. I was simply stating the facts, because Derek had built his career on the trust of the people in this room, and those people deserved to know what kind of architecture they were standing inside. Then I turned to Derek directly. I said the divorce papers would be filed in the morning. I said I had already spoken to the attorneys. I said the prenuptial agreement he had drafted, the one that limited my claim on his assets in the event of dissolution, included a fraud clause, and that clause, as his own attorneys would shortly confirm, invalidated the agreement entirely in cases of documented deception. I said my attorney was very good, and that his was about to have a complicated few months. I said one more thing, quietly, just for him, close enough that the words were only ours. I said, "You left her at 9 years old, you attended her science fair from a folding chair and then came home to me. I want you to think about that every day for the rest of your life, because I intend to make sure she never has to." I picked up my purse from the table behind me and I walked out of the Peninsula Hotel. Priya had arranged a car. Sandra texted before I reached the curb. Derek had been approached by 2 of his senior partners before he had made it to the elevator, and the body language in the lobby camera feed was not good for him. I replied with a single thumbs-up emoji and put my phone in my bag. The drive to Linwood House took 11 minutes. I know the night coordinator there. Her name is Val, and she has the specific, exhausted competence of someone who has worked with the system long enough to have stopped being surprised by it and started being useful. She had agreed to let me come by after hours, contingent on whether Jade wanted to see me. She had asked Jade earlier that evening, without telling her why. Jade had said, and I quote, "Yeah, fine, but not if she's going to be weird about it." Val let me in and pointed me toward the back study room. Jade was at the table with an architecture book open and a sketch pad in front of her. She looked up when I came in and studied my face the way she studies load-bearing diagrams quickly, looking for the stress points. She said, "You look like something happened." I sat down across from her. I put my hands flat on the table, the way I do when I am about to say something that matters, and I want to say it correctly. I told her there was something I needed to tell her. Something difficult and something true, and that she should know I was not going to make any demands of her, and I was not going to expect anything, and that when I was done she could tell me to leave and I would. She said okay. I told her everything. The delivery record, the DNA test, the timeline, Derek, all of it. I used clear sentences, and I did not soften anything that didn't need softening, because she was 15 and she was not fragile, and treating her like she was fragile seemed like the last thing she needed from one more adult in her life. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. She looked at the sketch pad in front of her. She turned her pencil over once between her fingers. I had learned over our Saturdays that this is what she does when she is thinking rather than performing thinking, which are two different things. She said, "So Noah is my half-brother." I said yes. She said, "That's a lot." I said it really was. She looked up. Those eyes, I had noticed them from the beginning without knowing why. They had seemed familiar in the untraceable way that things sometimes do. I knew now. They are my mother's eyes. My grandmother's eyes. A particular shade of brown-green that I have always considered unremarkable and that I have never, in 14 years, seen in the boy I raised. She said, "What do you actually want from me?" I said, "Nothing." I said I wanted to keep showing up on Saturdays if she'd let me. I said I wanted to begin guardianship proceedings, not because she owed me anything for it, but because she deserved to have someone doing the paperwork, and I was good at paperwork. I said if she ever wanted more than Saturdays and paperwork, the door was open, and if she never did, I would still do the paperwork and I would still show up, because that was true regardless. She was quiet again. Then she said, "The guardianship thing. Does that mean I'd have to move?" I said not unless she wanted to. She said, "Because I'm not leaving the friends I have here, and I'm staying at my school." I said, "Absolutely." She said, "And I'm not calling you Mom." I said that was entirely her decision and always would be. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back at her sketchpad and made a small note in the margin of the drawing she had been working on. A notation about a support column she'd been rethinking. She said, "The Saturday after next is the community center open house. They want someone to explain how the building was renovated. I told Val I could do it, but it's better with 2 people. I said I would be there." She nodded like that was settled. She did not hug me. She offered me a piece of the slightly stale granola bar she'd been eating, which I accepted because it was, I understood, exactly what it was, a gesture so small and so deliberate and so genuinely hers that it was more than any declaration could have been. I drove home through a city that looked the same as it always has from the outside. The lights, the lake, the grid of streets that I have known for 20 years, everything exactly where it was, and nothing at all the way it seemed. Noah was awake when I got back, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of water and the look of someone who has been waiting and does not want to admit it. Derek had called him. I had expected that. I sat down across from him and I told him the truth. All of it, clearly, without cruelty but without softening what didn't need softening. I told him about Jade. I told him what the DNA test had shown. I told him that the story he had been told about our family had been constructed by his father to serve his father's purposes, and that it was not his fault, and that it was also not going to continue. He was very still for a long time. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard from him before, younger, less certain, stripped of the performance, "She's really my sister?" I said half-sister, same father. He looked at the table. He swallowed. He said, "I was mean to her." I said yes. I said that was something he was going to have to sit with, and something he was going to have to do the work of repairing, and that the letter he had written was a beginning but only a beginning. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't reach for Derek's name as a shield, the way he usually does. He said, Is she okay? Like, is she doing okay?" And I thought about Jade at the drafting table, about the precise annotations in the margins, about her matter-of-fact instructions for where to put the support column, and her complete indifference to impressing anyone. I said she was doing better than okay. I said she was doing remarkably well, given everything, and that the most useful thing he could do was stop making it harder for her and start figuring out how to be something worth having as a brother. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Can you make sure she knows the letter was real? That I wasn't just doing it because you told me to?" I said I would tell her. He went to bed without another word. I listened to him on the stairs, the weight of his steps more careful than usual, a boy beginning to understand the kind of floor he's been walking on. There is still a great deal of work to do. Derek's attorneys are exactly as complicated as mine predicted. The guardianship process moves at the pace of the family court system, which is to say slowly, with paperwork in quantities that would surprise a civilian. I keep a running file. I review it weekly. Noah starts therapy on Thursday. His therapist came recommended by Val, who has seen many children work through worse and who believes, cautiously, that he has more in him than the version his father spent 14 years cultivating. I am inclined to agree. He is not the boy I thought I was raising, but he is not entirely his father's project either. There are things in him that are genuinely his, and some of them are good, and I am choosing to work with those. Jade came to the house for the first time last Saturday. She did not come inside. She stood on the back deck with a cup of tea I had made her strong, no sugar, I had learned this, and looked at the garden for approximately 4 minutes, making one comment about how the drainage on the south side of the property was clearly causing the turf damage near the fence. She was right about the drainage. She came back inside and spent 2 hours at the kitchen table working through a design problem she had been stuck on, and I worked beside her on a project from my office, and we talked when there was something worth saying and didn't when there wasn't. Noah came down at some point and said hi from a careful distance, and Jade looked at him for a moment and said hi back, and that was that. When she left, she paused at the door. She said, "Next Saturday I'm going to that structural engineering lecture at the public library. It's free. The presenter is from Northwestern." I said it sounded good. She said, "It's at 10. You'd need to be ready by 9:30. I said I would be ready by 9:30. She looked at me with those eyes, my grandmother's eyes, my mother's eyes, mine, and something moved in them, not softness exactly, but the careful opening of a door that has been locked for a very long time. She left. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the street for a moment after she had turned the corner and disappeared. The afternoon was ordinary. Traffic on the next block, the sound of someone's lawn service 2 houses down, the light changing the way it does in October. I am 32 years old. I am an architect. I know how to look at a structure and determine what it needs, what has been left out, what has been compensating, what will hold and what won't. I have a daughter. I have had her for 15 years, built mostly without me, and she is the most precisely engineered person I have ever encountered, all load-bearing beams and careful foundations and absolutely zero decorative flourish. She is not mine in the sense that she owes me anything. She is mine in the sense that somewhere in the original blueprint, before anyone had the chance to redraw the plans, we were meant to be standing in the same building. We are working on it, one Saturday at a time. One accurate thing after another. It is, I have decided, more than enough to start.